Yeah.
Yes.
So, thank you very much for this introduction. It's my pleasure to be here with you all. And I'd like to, my lecture here is going to be a little bit maybe different than some of the others in that it's at the beginning of my fellowship rather than at the end. So I thought I would talk about, rather than the work I've done here, which I obviously can't yet, talk about how I'm thinking about the data that we acquired, you know, why we're doing this research, why I'm taking the particular approaches that I'm taking. And I would be happy if we constructed this something even more like a seminar, whereas if you have questions or you want to, comments, people who I'm working with are also here, you have something to say, please chime in. It doesn't have to be me preaching to you. We can have a discussion. That's also fine with me. So as Jana mentioned, my work focusing on mountains, it kind of came from, I work with data modeling and producing predictive models and using archaeological site data. And while working at Sagalassos, which has a massive site database from the territory, they have this territory which they have somehow secured in the North Taurus Mountains based on the ancient territory of Sagalassos. It's a huge area of 1,200 square kilometers where they've been working since the 90s. So they have a massive amount of site data. When we started working there, when I started working there in 2016, it was about 300 or so sites known in this territory. After I finished our surveys for my PhD work, it was doubled to about 780. But we noticed that when we began the work, that there was a big hole, big gaps in certain parts of the territory. And these were mainly focused on the mountains. And this is partially due to the way archaeologists tend to encounter material culture. It's often accidental. So we find material usually when it comes into contact with modern land use, so farming or building houses and roadways and all these sorts of infrastructure. So usually where we're using the land, we find ancient remains. And if this is how we're building up a data set, you can see already the problem there, that there's a bias there, that where we're using the land, we're finding, this is where we're finding archaeological remains. And so it can present a kind of false picture that, oh, they're interested in the same landscapes that we're interested in. And there's also logistical reasons why working in mountains are quite difficult, which I'm sure you can imagine. Getting vehicles up there, getting materials, tools, students and food and, all these things up there, it's quite difficult logistically. So these are some of the reasons why a lot of the data that we have is coming from lowlands. But when you're building predictive models, this is a really big problem, that your data set is not, that has such as this bias baked right into it. So, we decided, my colleague Rolf van Dam and I decided that we wanted to do a mountain survey to kind of balance this out. And we found really completely different archaeological patterns in the mountains, even some periods that weren't present at all in the lowlands that were thought to be absent from the entire territory that then we found in the uplands. But when digging into it, I found that this is an even larger problem. And it's really a problem in archaeology in terms of research design. It's getting better. Recent research, and when I say recent, I mean maybe over the past decade or so. But a lot of archaeological research now is on these big data projects where they're using legacy data. It's getting harder and harder to excavate and acquire new data in some places. So we're working a lot with this legacy data. And so these big holes, they're a big problem. It's baked into preconceptions about these landscapes, which when we kind of approach designing, especially perspection, you think about where would these people be? Where should I look for new sites? And our modern lens, it's very difficult to avoid the pitfalls of making assumptions about where people would be interested in settling. So some of these issues, and these are just some examples of how landscapes like mountains, there's also landscapes like deserts and badlands and seascapes and all these different types of areas which are also considered marginal in the study of archaeology. But we're going to focus on mountains here. And these are some of the reasons that these areas are considered marginal. I'm going to use marginal. This is kind of a loaded term. So I'm going to give some sort of specific examples of what I mean. But this is just kind of outside of the core focus of settlement activity, economically marginal, culturally marginal. And you can see, for example, if you look at some of the numbers, that 1/3 of the global population lives on the coast. So if you're thinking as an archaeologist, it's difficult to move away from that, to get that concept out of your mind. You think coast, this is where trade is happening, this is where business is happening, this is where production is happening, right? And 60% of the global population lives in towns or cities. We've seen a massive urban migration over the past century or so. And so people are leaving these small villages. Most of the, the commerce is happening in the cities, in the towns, in the urban centers. Farmland, agricultural land, just 15%, this is the example of Europe, but just 15% of agricultural land is in the mountains. And if you think about the vast areas of Europe which are mountainous, especially in southern Europe, this is a shockingly small number, right, 15%. And it's focused on very specific crops, like olives, for example, tea, and therefore most of the agriculture, cereal agriculture, is happening in lowlands, in flat areas, and these are examples of the same types of biases I mentioned at the beginning, that these are the same areas where our current land uses are going to be intersecting with archaeological remains. There are other ways that mountains may be considered marginal. These are kind of cultural biases and preconceptions that we all tend to have because of popular culture and literature. Mountains as a kind of foreboding or dangerous place or mysterious place. You see a lot of these kind of ideas forming in the late 18th and 19th century literature. You still see the influence on cinema today. Whether it's Dracula's castle in the mountains, you can watch any children's cartoon. The evil villain has a mountaintop castle, or Frankenstein in the Alps. Even the Albanian Alps, the mountain range, northern Albania. The other name for it is the Accursed Mountains. The very name of the mountains is the Accursed Mountains, because the legend says that Satan came from hell and formed those mountains with his hand. So there's this idea that the mountains are a dangerous, scary place, right? A place that you don't want to go, you don't want to be at night, you don't want to stay around. On the other hand, another kind of prohibitive way to imagine mountains is that they're places of reverence, pristine places for pilgrimage. Not places for everyday life, but places that you visit, places that if you want to stay, you must take vows or something like that. And certain cultures view the mountains themselves as holy, as gods, as places that that you don't touch, that you don't disturb, or places that we monumentalize and have monumentalized throughout history. And of course, another obvious one is these are places for play, places for sport and recreation and holiday. It's something that you do to escape normal life. You go there for a week, you go there for 2 weeks, maybe you have a holiday house or you have a cabin. You spend some time there, you take the family, you spend a bunch of money, but then you go back to your real life. Real life isn't there. Real life is here. It's in the city. It's where your job is. It's where the university is, etc., etc. So these are some of the ways that we kind of just make assumptions about mountains as marginal places, not places where people live, where people subsist, where people have different ways of life. But it's worth considering mountains, really, mountainscapes as dynamic economic and social spaces. So if you think about just the economic output of mountains, they contain vast resources of stone and minerals, precious metals. You have, of course, lumber extractions and medicinal herbs and plants. Water security is really highly dependent on the preservation of these mountainscapes, the glaciers, groundwater supply, reservoirs, both natural and man-made reservoirs. And these landscapes are very key to certain economies and ways of subsistence. As I mentioned, some crops, they are almost exclusively grown in mountainscapes. And herding, I mean, we all know the story of Cain and Abel. It's this ancient struggle between the farmer and the shepherd. Mountains are one of the only places really where herding practices can still take place, where animals can graze without coming into conflict with cereal agriculture. So they really depend on these landscapes in order to be able to continue to be herding. But these mountain villages and these mountainous areas are also really cultural reservoirs. These are places where people maintain ways of life which have often been lost in more cosmopolitan urban centers. These are places where people like to go to get back to their roots, where they like to see traditional ways, where they like to visit grandma, they like to see how things used to be. So they're sort of like, can be these kind of cultural reservoirs. And they're also cultural intersection points. Mountains are often borders where we see, they're natural borders, and they've been used in this way to draw modern political borders. So they're often also intersectional points, intersections between different cultures, which are also really interesting to study from an anthropological point of view. And mountains are also places where, people have often throughout history sought refuge and safety when things are getting bad, when things are tumultuous, when there's warfare and strife. In urban centers, people will often flee to the mountains to hide and look for safety. So it's appropriate, I think, to view mountains, to accept that mountains have in the past and always will be viewed in a very diverse way, and have been viewed many different ways throughout history, much different than the way we may be viewing them today. And it's important that we think about that when we construct our research, that perhaps mountains were viewed in a very, very different way that we can't even relate to in a different time period. So to bring in why this matters to our project, we began this research in the Korça Plain. You can see the inset map here in southeastern Albania, because there's a concentration of Neolithic sites. Now, Neolithic, this is the earliest farming cultures. So these are the people who first began to adopt a productive subsistence economy. First farmers, first animal herders. And in this area, the time period varies depending on where we're talking about. But in Albania here, it's around the mid-7th millennium. So these are some of the earliest farmers in all of Europe. And it's a really special place because we have a big concentration of these sites in the Korça Plain. And notice their position around the ring, and that'll be relevant in a moment. But we set out to do this project here. We named it Contextualizing the Neolithic at the Korça Plain. The goal was to look at these sites in their totality, and also in the totality of their landscape and in their historical and chronological context. How did these sites emerge as they went through their various iterations, let's say from the early Neolithic to the middle to the late? What was happening climatologically, socially, within the local environment? And how can we see that the land use behavior may have been affected by these things or was affecting these things? And so we chose these two areas. You can see these two red bounding boxes, Survey Area 1 and Survey Area 2, to explore the connections between the Korça Plain and the adjacent lakes, Lake Prespa and Lake Ohrid. This one you can see aren't able to go directly to the lake shore, unfortunately, because this is the border with North Macedonia. So our research had to stay within Albania. Now, I told you to take a look where those sites were positioned before, and now you can see the reason here, because there was previously a lake situated, Lake Mali, in this Korça Plain. It's been drained. It was drained in the mid-20th century. But you can see this reconstruction here with all of the lakes intact. And you really have a landscape of lakes here. Little Lake Prespa here. This is the source of the water for the two larger lakes here. Little Lake Prespa flows into Lake Prespa, which flows into Lake Ohrid. And you have Lake Malik here below. So we did our first survey about 1 year ago, a little more than 1 year ago, in the fall of 2022. And this was an on-site survey, so we visited these sites where we already knew the locations to really secure the location, get better coordinates, and to ascertain the extent of the site and look for what material we had there, which periods were represented. To our surprise, we found that at almost every one of these sites there was significant multi-period occupation, so not just the Neolithic, which is what we were looking for, but other periods as well. And we found an interesting pattern that in the earlier periods, the early Neolithic, for example, the sites were more likely to be located lower in the plain, and as time went on, they moved to higher elevations. So this year, this summer, we decided to do an intensive off-site survey. So off-site means we don't know what's there. We're not basing the survey around any known sites. We go off into the landscape. We do a random transect through and try to take an unbiased sampling of material. This is just a little graphic of how we walk the fields. We space ourselves out, 10 meters between, usually 5 to 7 field walkers. And we collect everything that we find, everything that's archaeological. So pottery, stone tools, metal objects, anything that's coins. I mean, we didn't find any coins yet, but this is something that maybe we'll find, we hope to find. Glass, everything like this. And we call this a total collection strategy. So we take everything. We're not looking for certain periods. We take everything that we find that's archaeological. And in some areas where it's too rugged to walk lines, we do an extensive survey. This means we kind of fan out. If somebody finds something, we all come together and we make a grid. And then we collect everything in the grid during a certain time. And then we add grids in any direction until we find where the site ends. This is our survey methodology. And we did a lot of interviewing locals to ask what they've seen, if they know of anything around. In interviewing the locals, it's incredibly helpful. They're incredibly knowledgeable about their land. So these are some of the goals of this upland survey. As I said before, we wanted to target the interfaces between the Korça Plain and the neighboring lakes, and to document the shifting land uses over time, to see in different periods where are they settling, up, down, east, west, and see if we can correlate that with environmental conditions and social conditions, and to map features which we don't have good data on. So we didn't have any maps of natural springs or caves, landscape modifications like terrace constructions. These are all things that we're interested in finding. And to locate material sources like the sources of flint and chert, what they use to make stone tools. So these are the areas that we surveyed. You can see the green. This is from 2023. Each of this green dots represents a field. The pink dots represent extensive surveys. And the orange is surveys from 2022. So you can see that the two areas we focused on is the pass connecting Korça to Lake Prespa and to Lake Ohrid here. We surveyed a lot of fields over 7 weeks, so 277 fields. This analysis is ongoing. This is what I'm going to be working on while I'm here. But several new concentrations were found of prehistoric artifacts, particularly in Survey Area 2, so in the northern part, most dating to the Late Bronze Age to early Iron Age. This is about 1500 to 500 BCE. And also Neolithic pottery and stone tools were recovered as well. So in Survey Area 1, this was this is Lake Prespa here in the Korça Plain. I was really excited about this area. It's a very nice pass connecting the two. I was sure we'd find loads of material. Found almost nothing in the pass. I'm not sure exactly why that is yet. We talked to some of the local shepherds who said it was deforested in the communist period, and when it was recently cut, they could find lots of material on the surface. But now the grass has grown quite high, it's fallow, and so it's possibly a visibility issue where we can't see anything. But I would like to return in a different season and see maybe if we can recover something. There is a early modern fortification structure here in the middle, but largely nothing was found in the middle. But at the northern end on Lake Prespa, we found this area was occupied during many periods. So at this Prespa terminus, we found prehistoric remains, late antique, medieval, and early modern. So this is an area, seems like an area was always an area of interest. And at the southern end, this is a really interesting site. Very, very high up. You can see here, this is a still running spring, which is fortified. So large fortification walls around it. And we found material from the late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, Roman, late Antique, and even a lot of imported wares during the Roman period, imported amphora, which shows that this must have been a significant site here. So you can see that they're really, in this period, securing the springs, and they're interested in defense. So if we look up at the northern part, Survey Area 2, near Lake Ohrid, we found several concentrations of prehistoric material from Neolithic to the early Iron Age, chip stone from the Neolithic, and a ground stone from Epipaleolithic, that's like Copper Age, 3000 BC or so, and a previously undocumented late Bronze Age hilltop concentration, which I'll show you. So this area, this site was known before. This is Blotza 1 and Blotza 2. These are two hilltop fortresses of the late Bronze Age period. This is the modern town of Blotza, kind of exists in its shadow. They have all kinds of legends about these sites, and they spend a lot of time digging holes in these mountains looking for the treasure of Blotza, which they think is a golden saddle. I'm not sure where they got the idea, but it seems pretty cool. So maybe we'll find it. I don't know. But this area here on the south slope is a large cemetery where we find lots of nice material on the surface, never been excavated. And just below was a marsh, which was drained also during the communist period. This was all known before, but what was unknown is up here on this protrusion. A local farmer told us that there used to be a lot of stones there when he was young, and that they took them away to build the houses. So we went to take a look, and we found a large late Bronze Age concentration there. And here, on this this slope here, we found this earlier Epipaleolithic groundstone axe. You can see this is Blotza 1 and Blotza 2. These are these two. So you have a kind of triangulation here of fortifications protecting this valley. So you can really see that defense here was the priority in the settlement pattern. So a little bit to the east, in this plain here, just behind Blotza, we also found a large concentration, multi-period. Here's Blotza 1 and Blotza 2 again, from the other side. Late Bronze Age pottery, early Iron Age. And these are two lithics from the Neolithic period. This is a core. This is the local material that we're looking for. And this is an import from the Adriatic Sea coast. And continuing in the uplands, this was a site we surveyed in 2022 called Burimas. This is a late Neolithic site, very high up, discovered during modern terracing, also heavily looted. But you can see that in the late Neolithic, they're higher. And that brings me to this next one, which was a very interesting site, very big, 35 hectares. You can see this maybe, this little line here. You can see it also from here, this kind of earthenwork ascent. We noticed it right away from the road. The date of construction seems to be unclear. I would like to do some work to try and date it, maybe some luminescence dating, so we can see maybe when it was constructed. But this entire area is a site. Loads of material eroding out. And a big surprise to us was that we found also late Neolithic stuff. And at the top, a cave with a running spring flowing from the top and a basin at the bottom to catch it. It's really interesting to have a late Neolithic site so high, because in prehistoric periods, normally they want to be close to their fields. So what could draw them up so high? It's still an interesting question. Maybe there was more topsoil previously and it's been lost to erosion. Maybe they're here for other purposes, like ritual purposes, such as this cave. But it's very interesting to see them so high in the late Neolithic period. We also found Bronze Age and Iron Age there. There's a possible Iron Age tumulus, so a burial mound. Lots of interesting stuff found at this site. So prehistoric land uses of the Korça Mountain. So if we look at the period as a whole, prehistoric period as a whole, we can see a few patterns. Resource extraction, of course, stone for tools, minerals for pigments, food procurement. So we have excavation data showing that a lot of wild game was found in the faunal remains, so they're hunting up here. A lot of perishable stuff that we can't find evidence of because it'll be long gone, like lumber and tree barks and materials for thatching and baskets. So my voice is a little bit lost. I was sick this past week. But since they're farming in the lowlands, we know that they got to go further and further afield to get things like lumber, which they would need a lot of for heating and building and that sort of thing. So we can assume that they're moving up. And site location, I mean, higher ground. As we see them moving up, as I said, in the early Neolithic, they're living really in the low parts. Late Neolithic, they're living very up high. In the late Bronze Age, we saw they're really at the top, the hilltops. In the image of the lake reconstruction that I showed you, you see that the lake was actually growing in these periods. So is it possible that the valley became too moist? They didn't want to be at the valley bottom, so they're moving upward. This is one possibility. There's also ritual use of the landscape, such as at the cave. And in the latest prehistoric periods, the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, probably defensive motivations were a key factor. So in ancient times, we don't have a lot of material from the classical Hellenistic and the Roman period. We do have a bit. So we have less evidence, and it's often at these same sites where we find late Bronze Age and early Iron Age. Now they're building with stone, so probably they're in the mountains looking for granite, looking for marble. And defensive motivations seem to be the foremost. So we find these arrowheads, bronze and iron arrowheads, and we also find evidence of local amphora. So this means they have local wine production. So you can see that this is continuing to this day, local wine production, which may mean that they were modifying the landscape, constructing terraces. It would be interesting to do terrace dating project to see were they constructing terraces in the Hellenistic and Roman period. It's a little bit difficult because a lot of the land was re-terraced during the communist period. So to be able to date it, we'd need to find some preserved ancient terraces. But this would be, I think, an interesting avenue for the project to try to find preserved ancient terraces and date them. And burials. We also have this large cemetery that I mentioned, which has some ancient ceramics on top from the Roman and Hellenistic period. So are they also burying there would be another possibility. In the late antique and medieval periods, you really see that the landscape becomes a religious landscape. Almost every small village has a church, built beautiful churches. Almost none of them survive. We just see the foundations. We see how substantial they are. The ones that do survive, like this hermitage on the island of Maligrad in Lake Prespa, close to our survey area 1, it's just absolutely beautiful. And this region, the Korça region, is known for its iconography. So Christian icons, this was the center of the production of Christian icons. The iconographic museum of Albania is in Korça for this reason. And a lot of the when a lot of the churches were destroyed in the region during the communist period, the icons were taken out and brought to were put into hiding, and now you can find them in this museum. And part of the reason why this was there's such a proliferation of churches here is because of the perceived healing power of Lake Prespa and the mountain springs as well. Here's the example of Peshkapi and the monastery of St. Nam. So this is in survey area 2. We have the headwaters of Lake Ohrid. So from Lake Prespa through karstic pipes under the mountain, the waters come just pouring out of the mountainside and flow down here into and fill Lake Ohrid. So Peshkapi, this tiny village, which you can hardly even see, it's so small, was part of the negotiation of the position of the border between North Macedonia and Albania. And Albania argued to have Peshkapi on their side because they wanted to have this important site close to the headwaters. Here you can see the monastery, the Byzantine monastery, which is, as I said, on the North Macedonian side of the border now, close to the lake shore. Here's what the headwaters look like, and here's the village of Peshkapi from above. You can see Lake Ohrid here down in the background. So during the early modern period, you have the arrival of the Ottomans. This looks a little bit, the formatting covers this up here, but so we have historical evidence of large-scale livestock caravans moving through this region. What you're looking at this photo, you can see three countries here. So you have Albania in the foreground, and North Macedonia here in the background, and this is Greece off to the right. So these animal caravans were moving through here from Albania up through Korça and around here into and off to Greece. These are what the historical records tell us. And we have Ottoman pottery, which corroborates this. We have a lot of dairy glazes. So these are specific glazed ceramic wares associated with dairy storage. And we also have a lot of coarse wares, which you would expect with pastoral activity. So this is like not very nice pottery mostly. It's handmade, water jugs, cooking vessels, things that you would take with you when you were, on the move. Not your nice stuff for your guests at home. So this corroborates kind of the idea of a shift to pastoral lifeways. And the Ottoman influence really, I think, picks up at this time. You can see to this day the heavy influence of the Ottoman occupation in this region today. We see it's interesting because you have the beautiful Mirahori Mosque in Korça itself, built in the 15th century, one of the oldest in the region. But in the smaller villages, we don't see historic mosques. So the mosques there are new, newly built. And I'm not sure if there were historic mosques and they also were lost during the communist period. We were told by the locals, of course, always that there was a church there. We found evidence of the churches. The churches were lost. They survived until the communist period and were lost. But we never were told of historic mosques there. But now there are modern mosques. So it's interesting. I would also like to explore that a bit. And we also see fortification structures. Of course, I mentioned the early modern fortification in the middle of the pass in Survey Area 1. And in the modern period, you see that this landscape really is highly active in a number of different ways. So this is the heartland of the partisan resistance to the Italian occupation and then the later German occupation during World War II. So there's trenches all over the place, turrets, altered caves, all these areas where the partisans were hiding out. And these partisans eventually became the ruling Communist Party, and they expanded on these constructions which they had begun to build during World War II. And the proliferation of turrets throughout this landscape is incredible. I mean, there are just turrets everywhere, at every crossroads, at every pass. Some places you can go and you're an hour's walk away from any road and you find a turret. Way up in the hills, you find barracks, some of these barracks were constructed at great, even unreasonable effort, very, very hard to reach. And here, at this time, we also see the destruction of the churches and the reappropriation of those materials to other functions. We were told that they were used to build stables, they were used to build grain mills, they were used to build warehouses. And in a very extensive construction of modern terraces. So currently in the mountains, how are they subsisting? Well, we see very heavy emphasis on animal herding. And the terrain here is extremely, extremely rugged. It's hard really to overstate just how steep it is. So you have an increase in elevation of about 1,200 meters over maybe a kilometer horizontal distance. It's straight shots up, but these you see still these shepherds. Their fitness is something which is really difficult to describe. I mean, I encountered one who actually near Survey Area 1, and he had cattle. And I'm talking about not sheep and not goat, but cattle. And I saw him going up the side of the mountain, and I asked him, why are you going this way, not taking this nice big clear pass where they made the modern roadway and everything. And it was interesting because we had our translator here, Pamela, speaking Albanian to him, and he had a very difficult time understanding Albanian because he spoke Greek. He's living in Albania, his village is in Albania, but he's a native Greek speaker, and he said he hadn't really spoken Albanian since he was a child. And we asked him, why are you going this way up the side of the mountain instead of taking the easy way? And he said, well, I'd like to avoid going by the villages. I like going by the villages. I can just go up and go over the mountain, and I prefer it that way. So this is something which you might consider completely illogical or completely counterintuitive from a spatial analysis point of view. A lot of people, I don't know if you work with GIS, you're looking for least cost paths. What is the easiest way to move from point A to point B? Well, for him, it wasn't about easy. It was about what he preferred. He'd rather go straight up the mountainside just because he didn't want to go past those villages. So this is very interesting when you think about trying to conceive of how people used the landscape in the past. You need to be careful not to assume motivations, not to underestimate their fitness and their ability to move these herds, even large livestock breeds like cattle. We see a lot of honey production, a lot of apiaries in the landscape. And the agriculture is really small field agriculture. So most of the fields are close to the villages, very small. There are extensive field systems which are not in use. So they're fallow, they're overgrown, and the villages seem to be largely depopulated of certain demographics. So you see children, you see older people, but the 18 to 50 group demographic seems to be almost totally lacking. And it's difficult to talk to locals without them telling you, my daughter is studying in Germany, my son is studying in America, my nephew is studying in Italy. So it seems like there's this entire generation or 3 or 4 generations have left the villages, and that's why you see this constraining of the agriculture to very small and a heavy emphasis on animal herding. You still see some ritual use of the landscape, which is also very interesting. So at Peshkepi, they have this very large crucifix, which is something like 10 meters tall. It's hard to capture in the photo. And below it, a cave here, which was difficult to reach. No. This cave, when I say it was difficult to reach, maybe we almost lost some students, but it took half a day to get to it. And when we got to it, we found that it's heavily used. People are going through great difficulties to reach this cave. And inside, you can see. So Peshkap means bishop in Albanian. You can see the graffiti of this man in clerical garb all over. This is supposedly the bishop. And inside we found photographs and clothes, offerings like this, and a rug for praying. People are visiting this site as a pilgrimage site. So they're still using this landscape very much in a ritualized way. Here we have a monument in this dense forest, completely inaccessible by car. So just a footpath. It's very difficult to understand how they brought these materials. But it's a World War II monument, a monument to a battle here. And we found there that there's evidence of gatherings and parties there. There were remains of balloons and confetti and cups and things. People are coming there to celebrate, coming on foot to use these places, walking deep into the forest. You can see just how the scale of it. And again, people coming at great expense by foot to access some of these places. And then, of course, there's recreation. So there's 2 national parks there. Prespa National Park, which is Albanian on the Albanian side, and Galichka National Park, which is on the North Macedonian side, which have extensive hiking trail systems, very challenging trails. And these trails are not mapped. And when we talked to the park ranger, you told us that they're not mapped because the area is used extensively by drug traffickers. And so they don't want them to have maps of the trails because then they think that they will exploit them for drug trafficking. It's also a known migration route. And in 2022, we were actually stopped by the police, our group, when they asked us where we were from, and we said Germany and America. They laughed and they said, "Oh, we thought Syria, right?" And we're like, well, they said, "Oh, well, because this is a migration route where we expect them to be coming." So this is also something that the park ranger said. So these are known migration routes. So these sites these parks are specifically not mapped. So it's interesting because you see that this landscape is again used by people who maybe don't want to be found, who don't want to be seen, like the partisans. It is also a place for hiding. It is a place to be reclusive. And here you can see a nice bear warning sign because they do have also brown bears in the mountains there. So, key takeaways of this survey. In terms of research design, I learned a valuable lesson about mountainsides versus passes. the motivation of the people using these landscapes can't be assumed. I mean, you know, your point of view of, well, obviously you'd want to take your herd the easiest way. It doesn't work. The motivation can't be assumed. This shepherd we met and other shepherds that we met, sometimes they go a certain way because they don't want to be seen. They don't want to. They want to be invisible as they move through the landscape. They prefer it. Maybe they prefer the view. So we need to be careful about how we assume motivations of people in the past. And perceptions of accessibility. That's another one. I think that if you see the way the pastoralists move through the landscape now, I think that the fitness of prehistoric people cannot be overstated. You can imagine that prehistoric people in general would be much more fit than modern folks. And if you see what they're capable of today, I think it's really important that we don't underestimate what they were capable of. And if we want to really get a total view of the use of the landscape, it takes a lot of preparation and logistical preparation to access some of these hard to reach places. And so a reevaluation of land use possibilities. I think there are areas where we might think there's no way that they were there. There's no way that they went up there. Why would anyone go up there? They're probably up there. They probably went up there. It takes a significant effort. But let's say if we're doing data modeling, you can use a few good data points and maybe then get a good idea of how they were using these landscapes. So to bring it back to mountains as a dynamic economic and social space, we see a lot of different ways that these landscapes have been used over time, but that they were consistently used, that it was consistently active, and that this is the first time here in this landscape that anyone has looked systematically in these mountainscapes. So all of the previous survey efforts happened in the Korça Plain, in the lowlands. So this is all new information to be added to, for example, predictive models. This would have been missing. So it's important to see that they are consistently used, and that is also important to constructing the big picture here, because human practice in these mountains is significant. And that's all. You can see here, this is one of the turrets that's been redecorated near the beach.